The temperature inside Jonas Whitfield's cabin had dropped to 15 degrees below zero, but he slept soundly through the Montana blizzard while 3 feet of snow piled against his door. The circle of stone surrounding his banked coals continued radiating heat into the small space, keeping the interior at 40 degrees without a single log added to the fire since sunset. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if frontier survival innovations like this fascinate you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story involves a technique that saved an entire settlement from starvation. The fire had burned low 3 times during the night, and each time Benjamin Wade had risen from his sleeping platform to feed it. Jonas Whitfield knew this because he had heard his partner moving in the darkness, heard the scrape of wood against the cabin floor, seen the brief flare of renewed flames before drifting back to sleep. By the time gray winter light filtered through their small window, Benjamin was already awake, crouched beside the stone fireplace, coaxing the coals back to life. Jonas sat up, his breath visible in the cold air. The cabin temperature had dropped during the night, despite Benjamin's efforts. It always did. The fireplace they had built against the west wall was functional, well constructed even, but it demanded constant attention. Let the fire die completely, and within 2 hours the interior would match the brutal cold outside. "Sleep well?" Benjamin asked, without turning from his work. "Well enough," Jonas said. "You were up more than me." 3 times. Could have been worse. It was February 1839, and they were in their 4th winter season as partners, working the beaver streams along the tributaries of the Bitterroot River in what would eventually become western Montana territory. Their cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by pine and spruce, positioned near good water and defensible high ground. They had built it the previous summer using standard mountain man construction, notched logs chinked with mud and moss, a single door facing south, 1 small shuttered window, and the stone fireplace that now flickered with fresh flames. Benjamin stood, stretching his back. He was 42 years old, weathered by 7 full winters in the mountains, and built like the German farmers he had descended from. Broad shoulders, thick hands, a beard that had gone completely gray despite his relative youth. Jonas was younger by 10 years, leaner, quieter, the kind of man who observed more than he spoke. "I will check the near traps," Jonas said, pulling on his fur-lined coat. "The ice should be solid enough." "Take the good axe," Benjamin replied. "Those beaver ponds will need chopping." Jonas gathered his gear: rifle, powder horn, shot pouch, trap sack, and the sharpened axe Benjamin had mentioned. Benjamin would stay at the cabin to process pelts from their recent catches and maintain the fire. It was a routine division of labor they had perfected over 4 seasons. Jonas worked the trap lines with methodical efficiency. Benjamin handled the detailed work of stretching and drying furs. Before leaving, Jonas added 2 more logs to the fire. The flames caught quickly, and heat began radiating into the small space. The fireplace drew well, its chimney properly constructed to prevent downdrafts. Benjamin had built it himself, using river stones, carefully selected and mortared with clay. It worked. That was enough, or so they had always believed. Jonas stepped outside into air so cold it burned his lungs. The sky was clear, the kind of hard blue that promised temperatures well below zero. He estimated it was near 20 degrees below, cold but manageable for men who knew the wilderness. He started toward his first trap line, following the frozen creek eastward. Behind him, smoke rose from the cabin chimney in a thin gray column. Benjamin moved about inside, already working on yesterday's pelts. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. Jonas had no reason to think this morning would be any different from the hundreds of mornings that had come before. The trap line check took longer than Jonas had anticipated. The beaver ponds were frozen solid, requiring extensive chopping to reach the traps beneath. By mid-afternoon, he had worked his way 5 miles from the cabin, and the temperature had begun dropping with alarming speed. He could feel it in the air, that peculiar stillness that preceded extreme cold. By sunset, Jonas faced a decision. He could attempt the return journey in darkness, risking a fall or disorientation, or he could shelter in place and return at first light. The temperature made the choice for him. It had dropped at least another 15 degrees in the past 2 hours. Traveling in such cold, in darkness, was suicide. He built a snow shelter against a rock outcrop using techniques he had learned years earlier. He packed snow into thick walls, created a small entrance tunnel to trap warm air, and settled in with his fur coat wrapped tight. He had no fire. In a snow shelter, fire meant carbon monoxide poisoning in the confined space. He relied on his body heat and the insulating properties of packed snow. The night was brutally cold. Jonas barely slept, shivering despite his furs, listening to trees crack in the freezing air. When gray light finally appeared, he emerged stiff and half-frozen. The world had transformed overnight. Everything was coated in thick frost. His breath hung in the air like smoke. He started back immediately, moving fast to generate warmth. The journey that had taken 5 hours the previous day now took nearly 4, fighting through snow and ice. As he drew within a mile of the cabin, he looked for smoke. There was none. His pace quickened. Benjamin always had fire going by dawn. Always. The absence of smoke from the chimney sent alarm racing through Jonas's chest. He reached the clearing. The cabin sat silent. No smoke, no sound. He ran the final 100 yards. The door was frozen shut, ice sealing it to the frame. He threw his shoulder against it. Once, twice. On the third impact, it broke free. The interior was dark and bitterly cold. Benjamin lay on the sleeping platform, wrapped in blankets and furs, completely still. Jonas crossed the space in 3 strides. He pulled the blankets back. Benjamin's face was gray, his skin hard as stone, dead, frozen solid. Jonas stepped back, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. The fireplace held only cold ash. He turned in a slow circle, taking in the scene. Benjamin's rifle leaned against the wall. Food supplies sat undisturbed on the shelves. Firewood was stacked beside the hearth. Flint and steel lay on the small table. Everything Benjamin needed to survive was within arm's reach. But Benjamin had not survived. Jonas moved to the fireplace and knelt, examining the ash. He could reconstruct what happened. Benjamin had fed the fire before sleeping, probably feeling ill or exhausted. The fire had burned for perhaps 2 hours, then died. Without heat, the cabin temperature had plummeted. Benjamin had frozen in his sleep. He had died 20 feet from a stack of firewood, too sick or too deeply asleep to wake when the cold came. Jonas buried Benjamin on a hillside, overlooking the creek where they had run their most productive trap lines. He spent 2 days breaking through frozen ground with a pickaxe, then covered the grave with stones to prevent animals from disturbing it. He spoke no words over the burial. Benjamin had not been a religious man, and Jonas did not know what to say that would matter. He returned to the empty cabin and sat on the sleeping platform where his partner had died. For 3 days, he did not check the traps. He did not process furs. He sat in the cold cabin, keeping the fire burning, replaying Benjamin's death in his mind. The horror was not that Benjamin had died. Men died in the mountains constantly. Grizzly attacks, falls, drowning in icy rivers, hypothermia during blizzards. Death was the accepted cost of the trapper's life. What haunted Jonas was the specific cruelty of how Benjamin had died. He had frozen to death inside a cabin, surrounded by everything needed for survival, simply because he had been too exhausted or too ill to wake up and feed a fire. Jonas began asking himself a question that most mountain men never considered. Why did fires need constant tending? Why did heat disappear so quickly once flames died? Why was there no way to create warmth that lasted through the night without human intervention? He examined the fireplace Benjamin had built. The construction was sound. River stones carefully selected and mortared with clay. A proper smoke shelf to prevent downdrafts. A chimney that drew efficiently. When fire burned in it, the cabin warmed adequately. But the moment the flames died, the warmth vanished. Within an hour, the interior temperature matched the exterior cold. Jonas began experimenting. He tried banking coals in different configurations, burying them in ash to slow their consumption. This extended burn time by perhaps an hour, but eventually the coals died and cold returned. He tried closing the chimney damper part way, attempting to trap heat inside the cabin. This created smoke problems and only marginal improvement in heat retention. He realized the fundamental problem. The fireplace was built against the wall. Half the heat it generated radiated outward through the logs, wasted into the exterior air. The other half went up the chimney. Very little heat actually remained in the cabin space. And the stones of the fireplace, while they absorbed some warmth, were too few and too poorly positioned to store significant heat. Jonas became obsessed with thermal retention. He needed a system that would absorb heat while fire burned, then radiate that stored warmth for hours after the flames died. He needed something that did not require waking every 2 hours to add fuel. He needed a way to sleep through an entire winter night without freezing. Most mountain men would have accepted that such a system was impossible. Fire required fuel. Without fuel, fire died. Without fire, cold returned. That was simply the reality of wilderness survival, but Jonas could not accept it. Benjamin's frozen body had taught him that acceptance meant death. Jonas finished the spring trapping season working alone. He collected the remaining pelts, dismantled the trap lines, and in early April made the journey to Fort Benton to sell his furs. The trip took 12 days on horseback through mountain passes still choked with snow. At the fort, he sold his beaver pelts for a reasonable price. Most trappers immediately spent their earnings on whiskey, gambling, and supplies before returning to the mountains. Jonas did something different. He stayed at Fort Benton for 3 weeks, and he spent those weeks studying how buildings retained heat. The fort's blacksmith shop fascinated him. The forge was built from thick stones, and Jonas noticed that even hours after the blacksmith finished work for the day, the forge structure remained warm to the touch. He asked the blacksmith about this. The man explained that dense stone absorbed heat slowly, but also released it slowly. A well-built forge stayed warm overnight. Jonas observed the baker's brick oven with similar interest. The baker fired the oven in early evening, baking bread in intense heat. By dawn, the oven was still warm enough that placing a hand inside was uncomfortable. The baker explained that the thick brick walls stored tremendous heat. One firing could provide warmth for 12 hours or more. Jonas began asking questions of everyone he encountered who worked with stone or heat. A stonemason repairing the fort's walls explained thermal mass. Different stones had different properties. Sandstone and limestone were excellent for heat retention. They were dense, absorbed heat efficiently, and released it gradually. Granite worked well, but was harder to cut and shape. The stonemason warned Jonas about one critical danger: never use river rocks for anything involving fire. River rocks often contain trapped moisture. When heated, that moisture turned to steam. The expanding steam could cause rocks to explode violently, sending fragments like shrapnel. Jonas absorbed this information with intense focus. He was learning principles that few mountain men understood or cared about. More stone mass meant more heat storage. Dense stones performed better than porous ones. The key was building enough thermal mass to absorb significant heat, then positioning that mass to radiate warmth efficiently. Before leaving Fort Benton, Jonas made unusual purchases. He bought a 2-handed stone chisel designed for splitting and shaping rock. He purchased a specialized hammer with a hardened steel head. Most significantly, he arranged to buy 40 sandstone blocks that were surplus from recent fort construction. Each block measured roughly 10 inches long, 6 inches wide, and 5 inches thick. Each weighed approximately 50 pounds. He paid to have these blocks transported to the nearest trading post to his territory, a journey of nearly 80 miles. The cost was substantial. Other trappers at the fort noticed his purchases and mocked him openly. Luther Hayes, a grizzled veteran of 15 mountain winters, laughed at the sight of Jonas arranging stone transport. "You building a castle out there, Whitfield?" Luther asked. "Or maybe a church? Seems like wasted effort when a mud fireplace works fine." Jonas did not argue. He simply completed his arrangements and prepared to return to the mountains. Jonas returned to his territory in late May and immediately began preparations. He selected a new cabin site half a mile from where Benjamin had died, choosing high ground with good drainage and clear sight lines. He spent 2 weeks hauling the 40 sandstone blocks from the trading post to his building site, a distance of 8 miles through rough terrain. Each trip, he could carry only 2 blocks using a pack frame. The work was exhausting, but Jonas approached it with methodical determination. With the stones delivered, he began cabin construction. But his approach differed from standard practice. Normally, trappers built the fireplace first, then constructed walls around it. Jonas built his walls first, leaving the interior completely open. The cabin was small, roughly 12 feet by 14 feet, with solid log construction and careful chinking. But there was no fireplace, no chimney. Just 4 walls, a door, a window, and an empty interior. Other trappers passing through the area stopped to observe. Owen Carter, a practical-minded trapper who worked streams 15 miles south, visited in early July and immediately noticed the absence. "Where's your fireplace going, Jonas?" Owen asked. "Center of the cabin," Jonas replied. "Floor level." Owen's expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. "You mean a fire pit? On a wood floor?" "A hearth, built from stone, circular pattern." Word of this plan spread quickly through the scattered trapping community. Within 2 weeks, 3 more trappers had detoured to Jonas's site to see what he was doing. The reaction was uniformly skeptical. Luther Hayes arrived with Frank Jessup, both men openly incredulous. Luther stood in the doorway of the completed but empty cabin and shook his head. "You are putting fire directly on a wood floor," Luther said flatly. "You will burn this entire structure to ash within a week." "The stones will protect the floor," Jonas replied. "Stones?" Frank laughed. "You hauled 40 blocks 8 miles to build a fire ring when you could dig a proper fireplace foundation and build a chimney in less time?" Jonas did not argue. He simply continued working. He began excavating in the center of the cabin floor, digging a shallow depression 18 inches deep and 4 feet in diameter. He removed the dirt carefully, creating a smooth-bottomed pit. Then he began filling it with layers. First, 6 inches of sand hauled from a creek bed. He packed it level and firm. Over the sand, he added 4 inches of clay mixed with water until it formed a dense, pliable mass. He smoothed this layer carefully, creating a fireproof barrier. Finally, over the clay, he spread 3 inches of gravel. This base layer took 4 full days to construct. Trappers watching thought he had lost his mind. Luther Hayes summed up the common opinion. "Whitfield's building invisible foundations for a fire that's going to burn his cabin down anyway. Man's gone strange after Wade died." Grief does that sometimes. Jonas ignored them all and continued working. With the base layer complete, Jonas began the most labor-intensive phase of his project. The 40 sandstone blocks he had purchased were uniform and ready to use. But they were not enough. He needed additional stones, and he needed them shaped to precise specifications. 3 miles from his cabin, Jonas had discovered a sandstone outcrop during his spring scouting. The stone was dense, fine-grained, and free of obvious cracks or moisture infiltration. Over the next 6 weeks, he spent every available hour at that outcrop, cutting and shaping additional blocks. The work was brutal. Using his 2-handed chisel and hammer, he split large sections of sandstone from the outcrop face, then shaped them into rectangular blocks. Each block required hours of careful work. He aimed for uniform dimensions, 10 inches long, 6 inches wide, 5 inches thick. The blocks needed to be similar enough to stack stably, but did not require perfect precision. By late July, he had cut 20 additional blocks. Combined with his 40 purchased stones, he now had 60 blocks total. He hauled them to the cabin site using his pack frame, 2 at a time. Now came assembly. Jonas began with the first tier. He selected 16 of his best blocks and arranged them vertically in a circle on top of his prepared base layer. The blocks stood on their long edges, creating maximum height from each stone. He positioned them carefully, forming a ring approximately 30 inches in interior diameter. The blocks fit together tightly, with gaps no wider than half an inch between them. The circular pattern was deliberate. A circle distributes force evenly and has no weak corners. It was also the most efficient shape for radiating heat in all directions. With the first tier complete, Jonas began the second layer. He selected 16 more blocks and stacked them directly atop the first tier. But he staggered them, offsetting each upper block so its center sat over the joint between two lower blocks. This staggering created structural stability, preventing the upper tier from shifting or collapsing. When finished, he had created a circular stone wall, 20 inches tall, double-tiered, with thick thermal mass surrounding a central space. Owen Carter visited again during this phase and watched Jonas position the final stones of the second tier. "I will ask again," Owen said. "Why 2 layers? One ring of stones would contain your fire perfectly well." Jonas stood back from his work, examining the completed structure. 1 layer contains fire. 2 layers store heat. Store heat? Stone absorbs heat while fire burns, Jonas explained. More stone means more heat absorbed. After the fire dies, the stones release that heat slowly. 2 layers will radiate warmth for hours longer than 1. Owen considered this logic, but remained unconvinced. Seems like double the work for marginal benefit. Luther Hayes, who had accompanied Owen, was less diplomatic. "You have built the heaviest, most complicated fire ring in the Montana Territory. Congratulations on wasting a summer, Whitfield." Jonas said nothing. The structure was complete. Now came testing. With the hearth complete and the cabin finished, Jonas conducted his first test on a cool September evening. He gathered kindling and small logs, arranged them in the center of the stone ring, and struck flint to steel. The fire caught quickly, flames rising within the circular stone wall. Jonas sat on his newly built sleeping platform and observed. Within 30 minutes, he noticed the interior surface of the stones beginning to warm. He placed his hand near them, feeling heat radiating outward. After 1 hour, the stones were noticeably hot. After 2 hours, touching them directly was uncomfortable. He fed the fire steadily for 4 hours, maintaining consistent flames. The double-tiered stone structure absorbed heat continuously. By the time he let the fire burn down to coals, the entire hearth was radiating warmth like a massive stove. The cabin interior had reached a comfortable temperature despite the outside air dropping into the 40s. Jonas banked the coals, spreading them evenly across the hearth floor and covering them partially with ash to slow combustion. Then he began measuring time and temperature. He had no thermometer, but he could gauge temperature by comfort and by watching his breath in the air. 6 hours after banking the coals, the top tier of stones remained too hot to touch comfortably. The cabin stayed warm. 8 hours later, the stones were merely warm, but still radiating heat. His breath was barely visible. 10 hours after banking, the stones continued, releasing gentle warmth. The cabin temperature had dropped, but remained above freezing despite outside temperatures near 30 degrees. Jonas had succeeded. His hearthstones stored enough thermal energy to keep the cabin livable through a full night without adding fuel. Over the following 3 weeks, he conducted systematic tests. He experimented with fire size, discovering that a moderate fire burned for 3 hours produced optimal results. Too small, a fire did not. Heat the stones sufficiently. Too large a fire wasted wood without proportional benefit. He refined his coal banking technique, learning the exact ash coverage that extended burn time without smothering combustion completely. He discovered his system could maintain interior temperatures of 40 to 50 degrees for 10 to 12 hours after banking, even when outside temperatures dropped below zero. A person could sleep soundly through an entire winter night without waking to tend fire. The practical implications were significant. Less firewood consumed, no dangerous middle-of-night fire tending in exhausted or ill conditions, no risk of freezing if sleep was too deep or sickness prevented waking. The hearthstones solved the exact problem that had killed Benjamin Wade. Word spread through the trapping community about Jonas's ridiculous hearthstones. But few men made the journey to see the actual system in operation. Most dismissed it as Whitfield's strange obsession, an overly complicated solution to a problem that did not need solving. Traditional fireplaces worked adequately. Why waste effort on innovation? Jonas did not care whether others adopted his method. He had built it for himself, to survive, to sleep through winter nights without fear of freezing. The system worked. That was sufficient. The validation Jonas needed arrived in mid-January 1840 with brutal, undeniable force. A massive Arctic cold front swept down from Canada, bringing temperatures that dropped to 25 degrees below zero. Wind howled at 40 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally across the landscape. The blizzard began at noon and intensified throughout the afternoon. Jonas, experienced enough to read weather signs, had prepared. He had ample firewood stacked inside the cabin, food supplies secure, and his trap lines already cleared. By late afternoon, visibility outside dropped to nothing. Snow piled against his door in growing drifts. He built his fire in the hearth stones at sunset, feeding it steadily for 3 hours. The flames heated the double-tiered stone structure until the rocks glowed with absorbed thermal energy. He could feel waves of heat radiating outward, warming the entire cabin interior. When he judged the stones sufficiently heated, he let the fire burn down to a deep bed of coals, then banked them carefully with ash. Outside, the storm raged with increasing violence. Wind drove snow through invisible gaps in the cabin's chinking. The temperature continued dropping. Jonas wrapped himself in furs on his sleeping platform and settled in for the night. The hearth stones radiated steady warmth. The cabin interior remained comfortable despite the howling chaos outside. He slept soundly through the entire night. When gray dawn light finally penetrated the snow-covered window, Jonas woke naturally, warm and rested. The cabin interior temperature had dropped, but remained approximately 40 degrees. The top tier of hearth stones was still warm to the touch. Coals from the previous evening's fire remained alive beneath their ash covering. He added kindling, and within minutes had flames burning again. He had slept through one of the worst blizzards in recent memory without waking once to tend fire. 4 miles away, George Mitchell was not so fortunate. George was a capable trapper in his late 30s, working beaver streams in the same general territory as Jonas. His cabin was traditional construction, with a well-built stone fireplace against the north wall. George had also prepared for the storm, but his fireplace demanded constant attention. He woke at midnight to feed it. He woke again at 3 in the morning, fumbling in darkness to add logs. When he should have woken at 6, exhaustion and cold made rising nearly impossible. He forced himself up, shivering violently, and discovered his fire had died to cold ash. The cabin interior had dropped below zero. George was shaking uncontrollably, his fingers numb, early symptoms of hypothermia setting in. He managed to restart his fire using birch bark and trembling hands, but it was close, dangerously close. When the storm cleared 2 days later, George made his way through deep snow to Jonas's cabin. He had heard stories about Whitfield's ridiculous hearthstones. He wanted to see them for himself. Jonas welcomed him inside. The cabin was warm, the stone hearth radiated gentle heat. George stood looking at the double-tiered circular structure and said quietly, "I almost froze to death 50 feet from stacked firewood because I could not stay awake." George Mitchell returned to his own cabin but could not stop thinking about what he had seen. A heating system that did not require waking multiple times per night was not merely convenient. For a man living alone in the wilderness, it was the difference between reliable survival and gambling with death every time exhaustion, illness, or injury made waking difficult. That summer, George built his own hearthstone system. He visited Jonas twice during construction, asking questions about base layer preparation, stone selection, and optimal dimensions. Jonas shared everything he had learned freely. He was not trying to keep secrets or claim ownership of the technique. He was trying to stay alive, and if others could benefit from his knowledge, that seemed proper. George's hearth worked as effectively as Jonas's. He slept through the following winter's cold nights without incident. His cabin kept livable by radiating stone heat. He mentioned the system to other trappers he encountered, describing it not as Whitfield's strange obsession, but as a practical survival innovation. Owen Carter, who had watched Jonas build his hearth with skepticism 2 years earlier, visited George's cabin in the spring of 1841 and saw the system operating. Owen was a practical man who responded to demonstrated results rather than theory. Seeing 2 successful installations convinced him. He built his own hearth that summer, using limestone blocks he quarried from an outcrop near his territory. The technique spread gradually through the northern trapping community. Not everyone adopted it. Luther Hayes continued using his traditional fireplace until he retired from trapping in 1842, never building a hearthstone system despite knowing multiple men who swore by them. Some trappers considered the upfront time investment too great. Others lacked access to suitable stone. But younger trappers and those who had experienced close calls with freezing began building what the community started calling Whitfield stones, or overnight hearths. Variations emerged as men adapted the design to available materials and specific needs. Some trappers in extreme northern territories built 3-tiered systems for additional thermal mass. Others used rectangular patterns instead of circular when their cabins had unusual dimensions. A few incorporated iron grates, salvaged from abandoned settlements, creating hybrid designs. But the core principle remained consistent. Double-stacked thermal mass stones arranged to absorb fire heat and radiate it for extended periods after flames died. Jonas himself continued trapping until 1844, when collapsing beaver populations and the shift from beaver felt to silk and hat production destroyed the economic foundation of the mountain man era. He left the wilderness that spring, sold his remaining equipment, and used his savings to purchase land in the Bitterroot Valley. He built a small ranch, raised cattle, and married a widow named Catherine Brennan in 1846. They had 3 children over the following years. Jonas never returned to trapping. When neighbors or visitors asked about his years in the mountains, he spoke briefly and without drama. When they asked about the hearthstones, he explained the engineering plainly and offered advice to anyone interested. By 1850, the overnight hearth technique had spread beyond trappers to early settlers building homesteads across Montana and Idaho territories. The system proved especially valuable for isolated cabins where single individuals or small families faced constant danger from winter cold. Several documented accounts from the 1850s and 60s describe people surviving extreme weather specifically because their hearthstones maintained livable temperatures through nights when traditional fireplaces would have failed. The innovation saved an unknown number of lives over the following decades. Survival often goes unrecorded. A man who sleeps safely through a blizzard leaves no dramatic story, no rescue account, no newspaper article. But the absence of tragedy is itself a form of success. Trappers, hunters, prospectors, and settlers who built hearthstone systems simply survived winters that might otherwise have killed them. The technique also provided economic advantages that extended beyond survival. Hearthstone systems consumed significantly less firewood than traditional fireplaces. For people cutting wood by hand in winter conditions, this represented substantial saved labor. The systems required no chimney construction, eliminating weeks of skilled masonry work and allowing faster cabin completion before winter arrived. Jonas Whitfield lived quietly on his Bitterroot Valley Ranch for 29 years after leaving the mountains. He raised cattle, maintained good relations with neighbors, and watched his children grow to adulthood. He never promoted his heating innovation or sought recognition for it. When asked, he explained it simply as a practical solution to a specific problem: how to sleep through cold nights without freezing. He died in 1873 at age 64 from pneumonia, surrounded by his wife and children. His obituary in the territorial newspaper described him as a respected rancher and early settler. It made no mention of his trapping, years, or the hearthstones that bore his name in mountain communities. But in the mountains he had left decades earlier, evidence of his innovation remained. Abandoned cabins still stood with circular stone rings visible on their floors. Some had collapsed roofs and rotting walls, but the hearthstones endured, weathered, and scattered, but recognizable. New inhabitants occasionally discovered these structures and, recognizing their purpose, rebuilt and reused them. The story of Jonas Whitfield demonstrates that frontier innovation often emerged from tragedy rather than ambition. He did not set out to revolutionize cabin heating. He sought to prevent the specific death he had witnessed: a man freezing in his sleep while surrounded by everything needed for survival. The solution required no new technology, only existing materials used with intelligence and care. Benjamin Wade froze to death 20 feet from stacked firewood because he could not wake to feed his fire. Jonas Whitfield built a system that made waking unnecessary. In doing so, he created something that outlasted his lifetime, carved not in monuments or written in books, but built into stone and mortar across the Rocky Mountain frontier, a legacy of warmth that kept countless people alive through the coldest nights of winter.